Okay, well, while we're getting set up, I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We're also going to have, I think, Jeff Jarvis was originally going to do this interview, and he apologizes he's not able to make it today. So you'll have to imagine someone with more gravitas and a much bigger Twitter feed as one actually doing interviews today. So we'll see if we can work that out. But many of you may actually know Rich Miner for another reason. So how many of you have an Android device? Ah, all right. Compared to, yeah, he did that. Right? It's quite interesting. So he's currently leading Google Ventures, and he came to Google Ventures by acquisition. Android was purchased effectively by Google, where he led platform development and ecosystem development. So it could hardly be someone more adapted to that particular topic. It's fantastic. Prior to that, I operated Orange, Vice President at Orange, R&D. Also, North Atlantic Orange Ventures, and ran Orange Ventures there. So we've been investing for a while. So we'll be speaking today about a lot of the investment opportunities and how they'll manage those on platforms. And before that, he moved into Orange through acquisition, having started Wildfire, a voice-based assistant that he also co-founded. So more detail in there. LinkedIn lists his expertise as startups, mobile devices, entrepreneurship, M&A, and speech recognition. So that's it. So we're all on there. He has a PhD in computer science from UMass Lowell and lives here in Cambridge. So with that, let's welcome Rich Miner. Thank you. So, Rich, why don't you tell us how you got started in all of this? So tell us a little bit more about your responsibilities at Google Ventures, since we're going to find out a little bit more about how that relates to platforms and how we're moving.
Sure. Well, Google Ventures has been investing since 2009. We are a corporate venture fund, but we're not a strategic venture fund. So we are 100% focused on capital returns and making money. And so as a result of that, while we get to benefit from the knowledge and insight of Google, and we get to look inside of Google to understand where Google thinks there's opportunities, we're not strategic. So we are really looking for the best teams, the best products, the best entrepreneurs to build large businesses and to build large returns for our LP, which happens to be Google. And then we've also built quite a reputation for being tremendous value-added investors. Again, we get to leverage our sort of knowledge of Google to help companies benefit from some of that knowledge. And then we also have built up within the ventures team a strong core of expertise, not only with the expertise that some of the partners have, but also we have a large user interface design team, we have great PR and marketing people, we have great engineering and security resources. So we lend out to our portfolio companies, which number north of 250, we loan out to those portfolio companies these resources to help them solve problems and build better products.
So that's a hell of a start. I know there's some MIT students interested in starting some things. So how would you choose these ventures to invest
Miner at google.com. And so, again, I think there's no one necessarily playbook that we use, but, it's always some function of the founding team, their passion, vision, and understanding of what they're trying to do, as well as the problem that they're trying to solve, and then ultimately the market that they can deliver that solution to. So function of those.
So do you think of platform businesses or ecosystem businesses in terms of investing any differently than you think of standard product line businesses? In terms of scale, any market opportunities?
Not really. I mean, I don't do any sort of deep thinking on the ontologies of those differences. Again, I think especially being here in Cambridge, where the number of startups isn't as large as it might be on the West Coast, I don't try and think of bucketizing things too narrowly. So it really comes down to people who I want to invest in and believe in, and then what it is they're trying to build. And of course, a number of those end up being platforms, but we also invest in point products and markets and other things.
So could you give us a couple examples of some of the biggest successes of those kinds of investments?
Sure. Well, I mean, we invested in Nest, and that was one of I think the top 3 venture-backed exits in the past 10 years, which happened to sold to our LP Google. In that case, it's interesting. It's they have discrete products, but I definitely think of Nest as a platform company wanting to build that sort of intelligence and ease of use platform in your house for things that you normally might overlook, but can add a lot of value if they're smart, intelligent, and connected together. So that was one exit. We had another exit in Retail Me Not, HomeAway, another exit, which again, these, both of those can be considered platforms for the different products that they were, building and offering. Silver Spring Networks was another exit that we had, which was effectively providing a network layer for intelligent metering for smart meters, and then Foundation Medicine here in the Boston area in the life science side. So those are a handful of the public exits that we've had. We've also sold companies to Google and to Twitter and to AOL and Facebook, Yahoo.
It sounds like a variety of different things with healthcare and home devices and home services as well. There was an interesting comment made earlier today. I think Eileen Gittins mentioned that in terms of one of the ways to compete with Amazon was to invest not just in the technology, but investing in the community. That actually helped buttress them against possible Amazon. How would you invest in building a community around a business?
Sure. I mean, I've seen a number of startups that look at this space, and I think about it myself. Not that I fixate on competing against Amazon, but I do, like to think about ways that you can bring the purchasing experience a little bit closer to home. And I think there's both closer to home can be a physical metaphor, and geographical metaphor can also be a logical metaphor. So there was a company that has since pivoted a little bit called OpenSky in New York City, and what they wanted to do was give bloggers the opportunity to turn their blogs into commerce platforms. So if you're an avid blogger about cameras, let's say, why not purchase your camera effectively from that person and have that be the purchasing experience? And if you do that, then it's 2 o'clock at night and you're having trouble, getting the right exposures, or the camera doesn't seem to be working. Who do you talk to at Amazon to try and get consultative help for the camera that you bought from Amazon? But I have a feeling if this is a passionate blogger and they're probably blogging at all hours and you were to send them a note and you were one of their customers and bought the camera from them, they would likely be there. Just like in the old days, the pharmacy or store around the corner when you actually had local photo stores, of which I think we still have Newtonville Camera in Newton, but they're few and far between. But it was sort of the online equivalent to that, where you would have that, bring that sort of personal purchasing experience back. And then likewise, you see that with people trying to do things to enable the exporting, and even Google is doing this, to enable the exporting of local inventory so that you can order something and, why not get it same day from a local merchant if you have the ability to do that. So we see that, and then, there's a lot of two-sided purchasing platform plays, which also, again, we have an investment in a local company here called CustomMade.com. They have thousands of makers who can make things for you. If I am sitting on the stool and I think it's comfortable and I like it, but I might like one made out of mahogany, I can take a photo of it, post it on the site, say I'd like a stool that has these same proportions but made out of mahogany. Within a few hours, I'll start getting bids back from makers. I can say I only want a maker within a 50-mile radius, and bingo, start to do a local transaction with something that's going to be custom built by somebody local. So wow. Those are all examples, I think.
That's wonderful. We've actually even used Newtonville Camera for reference. The amounts we're charging for passport photos, I think they're doing okay, but I think you might go online to get some of those pictures. Some different question on this. Jose Fuentes talks about educational platforms, and I got to say, as an educator, I'm quite interested in the future of education platforms, particularly at how things might be changing with massive open online courses, or the shift in demand on law schools is actually changing a lot. Have you made any investments in education platforms, or would you have any advice for those investing in such platforms?
Yeah, we certainly look at education quite a bit, and I think it is something that is going to be disruptive, but I think the rate of disruption and the type of disruption is maybe a little bit different than some people originally thought. I think there were definitely early startups that thought they could kill the university in a matter of a few years and build their online universities with the same brand strength. And I think, the institutions like the one that we're sitting on the campus of, those brands don't go away very quickly, and I think people also undervalue the social and other benefits. Now, there's definitely the ability for these institutions to export that brand, because there's a much more demand for that brand than they're able to satisfy here on campus. So that's clearly one way that you'll see education delivered, and I think there needs to be better platforms for the distribution of that kind of content. I think the biggest shift, two biggest shifts that people see and are trends are the inversion, the inverting of the classroom, in that it used to be, and still often is, that we rely on the classroom lecture as the place where you're going to get your lecture. And I've had plenty of good physics teachers and other teachers, but I think we'd probably agree that, if you could get the best relativity lecture that Richard Feynman gave, and had that be the relativity lecture that you could learn from versus your average university physics professor, consuming that Richard Feynman lecture would probably be a better educational experience than your average professor. And so being able to get that best-in-class content of lectures as opposed to repeating that same exact drill, picking a perfect one, and having that be a reference and letting people consume that kind of content. But then when it comes time to the problem solving, which is typically done at home, alone in the dorm room, when you're stuck on something and there's no one around and it's 2 in the morning, there's nothing to do, bringing more of that problem solving into the classroom where things can be more collaborative, I think you're definitely seeing a lot of people talk about that kind of inversion, and that requires a lot of infrastructure to give you the ability to find, replace, keep, score, vote up that best-in-class content for any lecture and any topic that you're going to have, as well as to get some consistency, because you don't want to have necessarily a different lecture with a different accent or what have you every night that you're learning. So I think there's a lot of interesting challenges there, and then I think there's also opportunities for these things to be platforms for education in a way that they're just not today. I mean, having 2 young kids, it's agonizing to me what I have to do to just find, I know a skill that they need. I know that in the hundreds of, thousands of apps in the App Store around education, that there's an app that can satisfy that need. And then it's just, I sit there as a co-founder of Android downloading, 20 different Alphabet apps. Google has launched Google Play for Education, which starts to do a better job of organizing and cataloging that, and that's geared towards academic environments. But I think these devices given to somebody with some combination of better organized content, self-assessment, and have that self-assessment, index across some ontology of a learning path, I think that combination can be very powerful, and at that point you can give these devices to kids and get out of their way, and many of them can just plow ahead and find the next lesson and be tested and move forward.
I gotta say, I both love and am mortified by your comment about things like Richard Feynman, where you can see his best lectures. I don't know if you're aware of it, but here at MIT there's independent activities period. You can actually still watch the lectures of Richard Feynman here in January. It's the second week in January, it always happens. And what I'm afraid of as academics is that we'll write the lectures and Morgan Freeman will give them. And we'll be SOL, as that may be the case.
You'll get 4 cents every time somebody views it. You'll be.
So I worry about this in the long run. Another interesting comment that was made is that, if you take a look at Duolingo, for example, this service you can actually do translation, but it's also doing education at the same time. There's an interesting case of trying to actually provide online education, but still it hasn't yet managed to achieve the in situ experience, being there with a community. Any business opportunities in trying to merge those 2 things, trying to actually bring education online to such platforms, but still give it the physical presence that you wouldn't have when you're just online?
Yeah, I think it's actually essential to sort of do that. And I think, again, this is something that's overlooked. I know a lot of the pioneers in the online education space are unbelievably brilliant, and as a result of that, they are very motivated self-learners and can take and absorb content and just move at their own pace. I think, however, the majority of the people in any educational level need and benefit from both group interactions, group challenging, and as well as mentoring and counseling, of which I think some of that almost needs to be physical. And so I think you do need to have a way to combine any sort of online structure with, certainly it depends on the type of content, but you certainly, I don't believe, going to give a complete, say, university experience as an isolated sole stream of lessons to somebody sitting somewhere and have that be comparable to, the sort of collegiate campus-based experience. So you need to bridge that gap somehow.
So let's flip the basic question and ask you from a different angle. So when do you anticipate that platform investments are most likely to fail? What are some of the things that you would watch for? What are the causes of failure?
Well, given such a broad definition of platform, I think you need to tighten that up for me a little bit, perhaps.
Sure. So one of them, let's say, I have a precise definition that we like to use, which is a published standard together with a governance model. The standard is something that allows others to build upon it, but the governance model is the rules of play, why folks would want to participate. Another way to look at it is there an ecosystem involved? Is value being created outside the organization as opposed to just inside the organization?
Sure.
So often the value is created by network effects. Network effects scale more easily outside the external boundary than inside the internal boundary of the organization. So we often think of it as components used in common across that platform that can be absorbed by third parties with a governance model and building an ecosystem with network effects.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, so platforms fail then, again, within that definition, thank you, for a number of reasons. One is they don't provide competitive services and functionality, right? So you're not kept competitive. Two is they don't scale at the level that, that they're being adopted and have problems there. Three, they don't have the right incentives for people on both sides, either developers to build on top of the platform or for consumers on the other side of the platform. And so, those are certainly, all things that we, were fine needle that we were threading as we were building Android, for instance, where it was, some combination of, well, we had to build it completely, but we also wanted it to be open, but we knew third-party developer environment was going to be important. We also needed to have handset OEMs adopting it so that actually be handsets. You needed to have carriers that were going to be there to buy the handset. So, it was a very careful balance of all of those parameters to get it to the point where it even had a chance of being able to start to take off and be successful.
So I don't know if treading on any thin ice, but what elements of the Android launch experience might you be willing to share in terms of getting that off the ground? That must have been a big opportunity and big challenge. Yeah,
well, I think the thing that most people don't realize is the amount of time that, so Google actually acquired Android in July of 2005. So we just had our 9th anniversary of that acquisition a couple of weeks ago. So, and the product wasn't launched until, the first device wasn't launched until 4 years after that. A year before that, we announced the product and made available elements of the SDK and started the developer challenge. But, there was many, many years and hundreds of man years worth of development that led into the building of that platform and the leading up to it. And, and again, some of the aspects of that were the desire to build an open source product, but to develop it as a single cohesive engineering team, but not as an open source development activity, which even that is a little bit nuanced because most people, when they say this is open source, it's like, great, where's the repository and let me jump in and contribute. And we didn't think we could deliver a best-in-class 1.0 product if it was developed with that nature. We did invite a lot of partners to work with us to build that platform, but it was very much by invitation and by licensing and adopting different code for codecs and for video and audio and for Bluetooth stacks and all of the other pieces that we needed to build into the platform. So there was a lot of that work. There was that balance of, yes, it will be open, but it's closed at the moment, but we are going to have this Open Handset Alliance and inviting people to participate at all different parts of that ecosystem, the handset OEMs and carriers and other technology providers. And so, it was a lot of technical effort to build, all of those pieces. And, we started Android as a startup prior to being acquired by Google. And we never would have been able to build, and this is why all of the previous Linux OS efforts failed. They were either standards or consortia, or there were 2 other Linux-based standards consortiums at the time, most of which were formed by hardware OEMs and carriers and didn't actually have any software companies on them. So there was, but at the end of the day, the amount of software that you needed to build was massive, and it really required both a large human capital investment to build it as well as a reasonably large purse to acquire certain pieces to help you build that platform.
Well, in addition to some of the chicken and egg problems of getting more developers to create apps and other things and that sort, also for the ecosystem.
And again, so we seeded that with this developer challenge, which for those of you who may remember it, and there was actually one team in Halvarian's class here in CSAIL that won one of the checks from that challenge. But we offered hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of prizes for people to build apps, and then we rated and voted on those apps, and so that was some incentive just to start greasing, getting people familiar with the platform. The other thing that we did was, choosing Java was not by mistake. It was we wanted to build, a platform that was going to be very familiar to many developers that they could just pick up, you didn't need an Android specific development programming manual. You could just walk into any bookstore, buy an off-the-shelf Java book, and look at our APIs and start programming without any additional need to learn the platform per se.
So one of the popular tweets that came out from an earlier talk was that open platforms win. Does it mean that more open is always better? Where do you draw the boundary?
Yeah, I mean, we subscribe to that, but even the word open is very, obfuscated oftentimes, right? So, Windows will refer, Microsoft, when I was launching the first Windows mobile phone at Orange, it was potentially going to be a successful platform in part because it had open APIs, right? So because it had APIs that were documented and you could build to it, that is one definition of open. But of course, as a carrier, if we didn't like the color scheme of the phone, we were told, to pound sand that, that's sorry, your name is Orange and your brand is Orange and every one of your other phones has an orange home screen. This is Windows Mobile. Again, this was 12 years ago. This is Windows Mobile, and this is what it's going to look like. And I found that, and that was actually one of the reasons I was like, boy, this would be really bad if these guys control the world. Maybe I should build a mobile OS, and that was one of my reasons for wanting to build Android. But so open, and Apple, for the same reasons, will argue that iOS is open. And again, those do have open aspects, and they create an open ecosystem. I think our definition of open was always you can go to the GitHub repository, you can download the entire platform, and if you don't like what we're doing or want to do a more significant variant of it, like say Amazon or other people, you can go ahead and do that.
So I guess part of my question is there a boundary where it gets too open? Linux, for example, might be one extreme where you can almost lose control if anyone can take and modify it any way you wish.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the goals. I mean, I think, so certain things get harder to do if it is very open, right? So, I mean, I think the way Google has managed it, where each release is controlled by Google and the development team as a complete release, not that they don't take feedback from all of their OEMs and the market, and not that there aren't people in the open community who are fixing bugs and doing other things, but primarily all the features and what that next release looks like is driven in large part by Google, and then when they get the bits completed, they open, they release a new branch with that new set of bits. I think, to me, that is a very good balance that allows them to continue to stay innovative and build a best-in-class product and lead and hit time schedules that sort of are synchronized with the market and do that in a predictable way, yet be delivering a very open product in that the bits are there and are available. It's harder to do that if you sort of just have an open repository and anybody can be checking in and to try and do that. So for me, the too open really comes down to how do you product manage effectively an open source product with a completely distributed workforce where the incentives are all different. That's hard to do.
That is hard to do. Actually, Steve Jobs had an interesting interpretation of open versus closed, and he reinterpreted it somewhat more favorably to Apple as
Shocked.
as closed being integrated and open being fragmented, often being harder to control the fragmentation on an ecosystem if you open it too much.
Yeah, I debate this one an awful lot. I think the worst fragmentation comes from open standards that aren't code but are documented standards. So for instance, if you go back to where the biggest nightmare of fragmentation, certainly in the mobile space, came from, it was in the old days of Java and J2ME. And the real reason for that was there was a great, nice specification for what J2ME was and what the Java standard was. And then there were tens or hundreds of implementations of the Java virtual machine. So you had the spec for the Java virtual machine, and those implementations were completely different code bases with no, it was just a different program on the other side of the planet looking at the spec and coding things. So random number generators, line algorithm, like every little thing was completely rethought and differently. So the fact that your program was going to behave differently on a different JVM, of course it was, no kidding. At least with Android, even though their different OEMs take the bits and build their own releases, 99.9% of that software is the exact same, right? It is all the, sure, the widgets might be a little bit different and the home screen behavior slightly different, what have you, but all of the executing algorithms within, again, almost every single API in that phone is the exact same piece of code. And so as a result of that, I think that's why every time people talk about fragmentation in Android, the conversation dies down pretty quickly, because the fact of the matter is, sure, there's different screen sizes, different colors, different resolutions, different networks. But guess what? In the PC days, we had that same exact issue. You had different graphics card, different network controllers, and the world worked fine, as long as that OS was the same code base.
That's interesting. Well, let me ask one or two more questions, and then see if we might take a couple of respectful questions from the audience, if that works. Are there any particular characteristic growth patterns that you look for when you're investing?
Sure, and I mean, early stage differs very very differently than late stage. So I tend to do a lot of early stage investment where you don't have the benefit of growth. You're sort of maybe what somebody did before. But if you're doing later stage investing, which we do a fair amount of as well, and again, there's different parameters that you can look at. When I think of growth, I think of, sometimes I'm thinking, well, what are they doing for ramping their monthly recurring or annual recurring revenue? So revenue is one type of growth rate. The other type of growth rate is what is, just user adoption and user signups. So how fast are we growing that population of users that are using our product? Another key important factor, especially if you're looking at user growth, is what is the engagement of in-app, on-screen, daily active use, what have you, and what does that number look like? And then, for gaming or other things, a lot of it has to do with in-app purchase. It's a similar type of thing as engagement. It's like, well, how much people are spending in-app and what are they doing when they're actually launching the product? So those are all important parameters that you need to look at. There's some people try and come up with, a science for some of them, based on the different stage of the company. But I certainly look at all of those metrics of varying form, depending what type of business it is, to gauge some element of traction, growth, and especially then you can start trying to do that relative to competition as well.
And among your various investments, what have been some of the biggest surprises?
Biggest surprises. I don't know if they're biggest surprises. I mean, I feel like the lessons that you learned are the ones that you already knew, but maybe forgot a little bit, right? I mean, beautiful products really matter. Enterprise customers are consumers too, so those products have to be beautiful also. So for me, the lesson that I always come back to is that consumer experience, the experience of the usage, that first N minutes of picking up an app, a device, a product, and the experience somebody walks away with oftentimes shapes your ability to capture that person and monetize them going forward. And that's sort of the biggest recurring lesson that I continue to see. The other one is strong teams. Strong teams perform well, so that's why finding the right people and the right teams is important. And statistically, strong teams perform better than even a strong individual entrepreneur. That having a team, especially a team that has done some things together in the past, statistically they'll outperform an individual investor.
Wonderful.
Or an individual entrepreneur.
Well, with that, let's see if we can open it up to questions from the audience. So, again, what kinds of things would be interested in learning about for Google venture investments?
They don't have to be respectful questions.
Can you hear me? My question is actually about Android. And one of the topics that you touched on was fragmentation. I happen to be in the industry, and everyone talks about that this being an issue for Android, right? Fragmentation in the number of OSs. Now we've seen, in China, Play stores, so copycat Play stores emerging. So is that really not you're not worried about that? That's my question.
Yeah, you're citing, there's two different issues you touched on, so I'll touch on the first one first. The first type of fragmentation, again, I'm just not concerned about it. It's a fact that if you were an iOS developer, and you're used to having, just 3 different types of iPhones with 3 different OSs, and three different types of tablets with 2 or 3 different, versions of OS, that matrix is smaller than the matrix on Android, where there's a lot different screen sizes, there's many different OEMs, there's a lot of different variants. But it's still with good development practices, and yes, you have to do a few more assets to handle the different screen sizes and aspect ratios. It's a very solvable problem, and again, it's the exact same work that PC developers have had to do for decades. in developing for PCs that came from Dell and Compaq and different OEMs with different graphics cards and network controllers. So that problem I'm not too worried about. And I hear developers, it's a little bit more work, but it works for them. And if it didn't work for them, you wouldn't have the million apps that you have in Google Play. The other issue, is, it is an issue that if you are, an OEM that doesn't want to, sort of work with Google and you want to try and have your own app store, then you have maybe a much more limited set of apps. But those are choices that, in general, I find the market tends to, neutralize that. If they're successful at it, they'll build a good platform by themselves, and maybe it will be fragmented, but maybe they have enough users. More likely than not, the guy that does actually decide to work with Google and have a much larger, gets to have Google Play and a much larger selection of applications is going to attract more users because that platform is going to look more attractive. And so the market might speak and they might win out. So I think, one is solved just by a little bit more work technically, but it's not hard and people do it. The other problem, I think, tends to be solved at scale by market dynamics.
Thank you.
Okay, we had a question over here.
It's a two-part question. What do you think you understand about the design of APIs and the design of incentives for platforms and ecosystems in the year 2014 that you didn't in 2010, 2009 when you sold out?
Let's see. Well, the API that you thought was stable and gonna last forever needs revision, right? So yeah, I mean that's not a big surprise. No, I mean I think it comes back to, again, smart people and smart teams. If you develop things right, open and generic, and by smart people, and hopefully you've done things right. But the fact of the matter is the world changed, hardware capabilities changed, screen resolutions change, and as a result of that, you can't help but have to iterate your platforms to keep contemporary. And so I think the key thing is, and I think you've seen this certainly in Android and a lot of other platforms, you just have to do continued investment, and that's why at least every year, if not more frequently, there have been updates to the platform and the APIs and the OSs. And then, in terms of incentivizing, I think that's been sort of figured out, which is, the biggest evolution, of course, is the ability to incentivize people by bringing them close to the customer, which they never had in any sort of a platform prior to having sort of an App Store, Google Play kind of model where, it was partnership sales or end caps at a computer store, right? The fact that now the app developer with sort of pressing an upload button and writing a paragraph can all of a sudden be immediately close.
Allow them. You don't push the developer away. You want them involved.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean that's that was the big shift and why Android and iOS and to some extent Microsoft started to become successful and why Nokia's no more and to some extent those guys. They weren't software companies, and they didn't understand developers, right? And it's not a big surprise that the guys who have sort of won in this new world were people that have had a long history of understanding developers and catering to them.
I saw where you say you sold Android for $50 million. You sold Android for $50 million. I mean, in the days of WhatsApp and all these trillion-dollar acquisitions and stuff, I was just curious. What was going on at the time, why that seemed to be the right number, and how you kind of decided to sell at that number?
Sure. Well, that wasn't the number.
I thought it said 50 on here.
Yeah, it could. I mean, I'm sure it says all kinds of numbers everywhere. I don't know that the number was ever published.
Oh,
so at the time, when we did sell for whatever number we sold for, we hadn't raised any venture capital, so the company was 100% owned by the founders. We were, as I mentioned, I joined Android, started working with Andy. Andy had been working on it a little bit longer, but I started working with Andy on Android in November of 2004, September to November 2004. I actually officially joined the company in probably around February of 2005. As I mentioned, we sold in July of 2005, and we still had 4 years of development before we got a product out. So, there was a huge investment on the back end of that acquisition that still needed to be done to build a real product. So, had I thought that we might have, 1 billion users, I might have put another milestone payment in the acquisition that the Google execs would have laughed at and said, sure, we'll give you $1 billion if you hit 1 billion users, but we didn't think of doing that.
That sounds very good.
Don't let the shooters fool you. I think you did all right on that.
Yeah.
You did really well.
Limited edition.
Well, excellent. Well, with that, Rich, thank you so much. We really enjoyed your insights.
Thanks.
Thank you.